The gloves hit the pavement an inch from my sneakers, and the whole street went quiet enough that I could hear ice cracking in somebody's lemonade. He was 22. A black belt. Undefeated in 3 amateur cage fights. And he was smiling at me like I was already on the ground. He had a phone out. He had an audience. What he didn't have was any idea that I'd spent the last 2 decades training men twice his size to survive things he couldn't spell. I looked down at the gloves, then back up at him, and asked the only question that mattered. Are you sure? My name is Ashley Parker. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my adult life, the only people who knew my rank called me Colonel and meant it with their whole chest. But on Larkspur Lane, in the quiet, manicured cul-de-sacs of Cedar Ridge, Colorado, I was just the woman at the end of the street who mowed her own lawn and drove a Ford F-150 with a dent in the tailgate I never bothered to fix. I'd moved there in June, right after my son Ethan finished 9th grade, chasing exactly what the real estate listing promised: peace. 20 years in the Army does that to you. It teaches you to crave quiet the way other people crave excitement. I'd commanded soldiers in the 75th Ranger Regiment. Led night operations where the margin for error was the width of a heartbeat. Briefed generals who didn't blink when I corrected them. None of that mattered here. Here, I was just Ashley, a single mother who waved at the mail carrier and didn't feel the need to explain what she used to do for a living. I liked that nobody looked at me twice. The house next door belonged to Richard Coleman, a real estate developer who'd built half the shopping centers on the east side of the county and never let anyone forget it. He backed his white Escalade into the driveway every single evening, engine idling a beat too long, like he wanted the whole block to register his arrival. His son Brandon was 22, home from a semester of college he'd dropped out of, and fully absorbed into what he called his fight career. Amateur MMA. A blue belt turned purple turned black in what felt like record time, though I never once saw him spar with anyone who could actually hurt him. 12,000 followers. A highlight reel that thumped out of his open garage every afternoon. I noticed him before he noticed me. That's usually how it goes with men like Brandon. They're so busy being watched that they forget to watch back. He revved his motorcycle under my bedroom window at 6 in the morning, 3 days running, before I'd said a single word to him. He claimed 2 parking spots by the community mailbox like they were his personal lot. I watched him once, from my porch, shoulder check a delivery driver half his size, just because the man's cart blocked the sidewalk for 4 seconds too long. Nobody said anything. That's the thing about neighborhoods like Cedar Ridge. Everyone's polite right up until politeness costs them something. Then the silence gets very loud. I ran every morning at 5:30, before the sun broke over the ridge, because that hour still belonged to me and nobody else. Old habit from the regiment, 5:30 was already late. Brandon caught me jogging past his driveway one morning and said something to his buddy, loud enough that he clearly wanted me to hear it. She doesn't even look like she could survive 1 round. His friend laughed. I didn't break stride. I didn't turn my head. There's a particular kind of restraint you learn in this life, one that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with knowing exactly what you're capable of and choosing, deliberately, not to prove it to strangers. I smiled instead. Not for him. For myself. Because if he'd known even a fraction of what I'd walked through, he would have swallowed those words before they left his mouth. I want to be honest about something. Part of me understood him. I'd met boys like Brandon before, plenty of them, before the Army got hold of them and reshaped what they thought strength meant. Boys raised on money and mirrors who confuse aggression with confidence because nobody ever taught them the difference. Under different discipline, Brandon might have made a decent soldier. He had the aggression. He just never learned the humility. And his father certainly wasn't going to teach him. Richard Coleman treated the neighborhood like an extension of his portfolio, something to be managed, curated, and occasionally reminded of who was really in charge. He was cordial to my face in that specific way wealthy men are cordial to people they've already dismissed. A firm handshake. A joke about the housing market. His eyes already moving past me before I finished my sentence. I didn't take it personally. I'd met 100 versions of Richard, men who mistake their bank account for a chain of command. What I didn't see coming, not that first month, was how quickly Brandon's attention would drift from me to my son. Ethan was 15 that summer. Quiet and thoughtful in the way kids get when they've moved more times than most, when they've learned not to get too attached to a school or a street because the army doesn't ask permission before it reassigns you. He rode his bike up and down Larkspur Lane in the evenings, headphones in, minding his own business. He didn't know the first thing about command presence. He knew about video games, a girl in his algebra class, and the skateboard he was saving up for. In every way that mattered, he was still just a boy. I watched Brandon watch him one evening from across the street, that same lazy, entitled smile creeping across his face, and something in my chest went still and sharp, the way it used to right before a briefing I already knew was going to go badly. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself boys like Brandon eventually got bored and moved on to easier targets. I was wrong. And it wouldn't take long to find out how wrong. There's a particular dread only parents understand, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but settles in slowly, like weather changing on the horizon. You feel it before you can name it. By the second week of July, I felt it every time I heard Brandon's motorcycle idle too long near our end of the street. It started small, the way these things always do. Brandon would cruise past the cul-de-sac where Ethan and the neighborhood kids played basketball, revving his engine just enough to scatter them off the asphalt. He'd park sideways across their makeshift court, forcing them to relocate, then sit in the driver's seat scrolling his phone, pretending not to notice the game he'd just ended. Once or twice, I could chalk up to carelessness. By the fourth time, I understood it wasn't carelessness at all. It was a message. This street belonged to him, and everyone else existed on his terms. Then it got personal. I came home from a video conference with Army Futures Command that had run 2 hours over, the kind of day that leaves your jaw sore from clenching it, and found Ethan sitting on our front steps, quiet in a way that put me instantly on alert. He wasn't crying. My son doesn't cry easily, hasn't since he was 9. But there's a stillness he gets when something's eating at him, a stillness I recognized because I'd seen it in young soldiers after their first hard lesson about the world. "Everything okay?" I asked, setting my bag down slow, giving him room. He shrugged. "Brandon called me Mommy's little soldier in front of everyone at the court today." Said it like a joke. Everybody laughed. Something tight and low twisted in my stomach, an old, familiar heat I hadn't felt in years, not since the last time I'd watched someone underestimate the people under my command and pay for it. I kept my voice level because that's the job. Not the absence of anger. The discipline not to let it drive. "What did you say back?" "Nothing." What was I supposed to say? I sat down beside him, close enough that our shoulders touched. "Nothing." That's the right answer. "Ethan, listen to me. Don't fight people who are desperate to prove something. That kind of hunger is bottomless. You can't satisfy it by giving them a reaction. You just feed it." He nodded, but I could tell the words didn't land the way I wanted them to. 15-year-olds don't run on wisdom. They run on humiliation and the desperate need to undo it. I understood that. I'd been 15 once too, though it felt like a different woman's life by now. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 10 days later, on a warm Saturday afternoon that should have been unremarkable, I was inside prepping dinner when I heard raised voices outside, Brandon's laugh cutting through the open kitchen window, sharp and performative. I stepped onto the porch and found Ethan standing over his bike, which lay on its side in the middle of the street, front wheel still spinning, chain half off the sprocket. Brandon stood a few feet away, phone raised, filming, grinning at the screen like he was building toward a punchline. "Say it again," he was saying, to the camera, not to Ethan. "Say what you called me." Ethan's face was red, jaw tight, hands curled at his sides in that helpless, furious way kids get when they're outmatched and know it. I didn't run. I didn't shout. I walked the same measured pace I'd use approaching a situation that needed control, not chaos, because chaos is exactly what an aggressor wants. It confirms they've gotten under your skin. "Pick up the bike," I said. Not loud. I didn't need loud. Brandon lowered the phone just enough to look at me, that same lazy smirk hanging off his face. Or what? I didn't answer right away. I just looked at him, really looked, the way you look at a threat assessment. Cataloging, not judging. Just information. His stance was loose, weight forward, the posture of someone used to being the most dangerous person in any room he walked into. But his eyes flickered, just for half a second, something involuntary and small. A flash of uncertainty he probably didn't even register in himself. I'd seen that flicker in men 3 times his size, right before they decided it was smarter to back down than test whatever was standing in front of them. For a moment, I thought he might actually pick up the bike. That's when Richard's Escalade pulled into the driveway. He stepped out mid-phone call, taking in the scene with the mild irritation of a man interrupted during something important. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask if Ethan was okay. He looked at me standing there in my gardening clothes, dirt still on my knees, and something about my stillness seemed to amuse him. "You military people," he said, slipping his phone into his blazer pocket. "Always think rank matters outside the base." I could have said a dozen things. I could have told him exactly what rank had taught me, what it meant to hold the line when everyone around you wanted to break formation. How many young men and women I'd watched grow into people far better than the boy currently filming my son's humiliation for likes. Instead, I said nothing. I picked up Ethan's bike myself, set it upright, and walked it back to our garage while my son trailed behind me, confused by my silence. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked once we were inside, voice cracking somewhere between frustration and disappointment. "Because he wanted a reaction," I told him, setting the bike against the wall. "And I don't hand out what people want from me just because they're loud enough to demand it." But that night, lying awake long after Ethan had gone to bed, I felt the old current stirring beneath my calm, the same current I used to feel the night before an operation, when stillness on the surface meant something entirely different was moving underneath. I understood, with total clarity, that this wasn't over. Boys like Brandon don't stop because you walk away. They stop when the world finally shows them, undeniably, that walking away was never the same thing as being afraid. I just didn't know yet how public that lesson was about to become. Labor Day in Cedar Ridge was an institution. The HOA closed off half of Larkspur Lane. Folding tables went up under string lights. Somebody's smoker filled the whole cul-de-sac with the smell of brisket by noon. Every family on the street showed up, whether they liked their neighbors or not. The one day a year the entire community occupied the same stretch of pavement. I almost didn't go. It had been a rough week, a budget review that ran long, a general who liked to hear himself talk, the low hum of exhaustion that never fully leaves you no matter how many years you've done the job. But Ethan wanted a normal afternoon, doing normal neighborhood things, and after the summer he'd had, I wasn't about to deny him that. We arrived a little after 3. Jeans, an old gray Henley, hair pulled back, nothing that would draw a second look. That was always the point. I brought a bowl of pasta salad, because that's what you bring to these things, and found a spot near the Hendersons' driveway where I could keep half an eye on Ethan while he threw a football around with a couple of boys his age. Brandon showed up around 4, already a few beers in, moving through the crowd with the loose, expansive energy of someone who knew he was the most physically imposing person at the party and had decided that fact entitled him to the floor. At one point he pulled up his highlight reel on somebody's phone, narrating his own knockouts like a sports announcer, and the small cluster of people around him laughed at all the right moments. The way people laugh when they're humoring someone rather than genuinely entertained. I watched from a distance, sipping lemonade, wanting nothing more than to get through the afternoon without incident. Around 5, with the sun dipping low enough to turn everything gold, Brandon's voice rose above the general chatter of the party, the particular pitch men get when they've had just enough alcohol to mistake volume for charisma. "Anybody here think they can beat me?" He called out, arms spread, grinning at the crowd like he already knew the answer. "Come on. I'll go easy." Nobody answered. A few uncomfortable laughs. Somebody's dad shook his head and turned back to the grill. The silence wasn't respectful. It was the silence of people who found him exhausting, but didn't want the confrontation of saying so out loud. That silence seemed to bother him more than an outright challenge would have. He scanned the crowd, and I felt it before I saw it, the exact moment his eyes landed on me, standing near the drink table with my lemonade, unremarkable, unbothered. "What about you, Colonel?" he said, and the crowd's attention shifted toward me like a tide changing direction. He'd taken to calling me that as a joke months earlier, a mocking little nickname, after Ethan let slip once that I'd served, and Brandon decided it was funny. A woman with a rank nobody in the neighborhood took seriously. "You're always so quiet, so calm. I bet you think you could take me." I didn't answer. I took a sip of my lemonade. He crossed the pavement toward me, unzipped the small gym bag he'd apparently brought for exactly this moment, and pulled out a pair of MMA gloves, red, worn from use, and dropped them at my feet. They hit the concrete with a soft thud that somehow silenced the entire block. String lights swayed overhead. Someone's phone was already up, filming. Every eye on that street turned toward us at once. "Come on, Colonel," Brandon said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that same performative grin plastered across his face. "Put your money where your mouth is." "I haven't said a word," I said quietly. "Exactly," he shot back, playing to the crowd now, feeding off the attention. "You never do. You just walk around here acting like you're better than everybody, like you know something the rest of us don't. So show us." Or is the tough guy act just for civilians who don't know any better? I felt Ethan's eyes on me from across the yard, football forgotten mid-throw. I felt Richard drifting closer, phone raised, that same amused superiority on his face, the look of a man who'd already decided how this would end and wanted documentation of it. I looked down at the gloves, then back up at Brandon. "Are you sure?" I asked him, calm, even, the exact tone I'd have used briefing a room of colonels twice his age about an operation carrying real risk. Something flickered across his face, that same half-second hesitation I'd caught weeks earlier in the street, quickly buried under bravado. "Scared," he said, louder now, for the crowd. I reached up and unclasped my watch, handing it without a word to Mrs. Henderson, who took it with an expression somewhere between alarm and disbelief. I walked to where Ethan stood, took my phone from my pocket, and handed it to him. "Stand behind the fence," I told him, quiet enough that it was just between us. "Whatever happens, stay there." He looked at me like he wanted to ask 100 questions at once, but something in my face told him this wasn't the moment. He nodded and backed toward the fence line, phone clutched in both hands, eyes wide. The crowd had gone fully silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Somebody cut the music. Richard stood near the front of the gathered onlookers, phone raised, filming his son's opponent with the confident ease of a man who'd already decided how this story would end. I stepped out of my sandals and onto the warm pavement, barefoot. The September sun sat low and orange over the rooftops, casting long shadows across a street that was about to learn something about the woman who lived at the end of it. Brandon rolled his neck, bounced once on the balls of his feet, and slid his hands into gloves he'd never get the chance to actually use. I didn't put on gloves. I didn't need them. "Whenever you're ready," I said. The whole block held its breath. Brandon came at me exactly the way I expected. Cage fighters, even amateur ones, are trained to close distance fast, to use aggression as a weapon before technique ever enters the equation. He lunged with a looping right hand, more show than substance, the kind of strike built to look devastating on a highlight reel rather than actually land on someone who knew what she was doing. I'd seen that exact shape of aggression 1,000 times before, in training rooms and in places far less forgiving than a suburban cul-de-sac strung with party lights. I didn't throw a single punch back. Not one. Not for the entire fight. That wasn't mercy, not yet. It was strategy. A man used to being the most dangerous person in the room reads a counterpunch as confirmation that he's in a real fight. I wasn't interested in confirming anything for Brandon. I was interested in ending this as cleanly and quickly as possible. I slipped his first strike with a small pivot of my hips, barely more than a shift in weight, and his momentum carried him half a step past me. The crowd made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a murmur, the noise people make when their expectations quietly rearrange themselves. Brandon recovered fast, genuine athleticism buried under all that bravado, and spun back with a low kick aimed at my thigh. I stepped inside it instead of away, closing the distance he desperately wanted to control, and caught his extended arm in a drag that used his own momentum against him. Simple technique, old as grappling itself. But simple only works if your timing is exact, and 20 years of training had given me nothing if not exact timing. He stumbled forward, off balance, and before he could reset his stance, I had my hip against his, one arm hooked around his waist in a body lock that took away everything he needed: space, leverage, the ability to generate power in any strike. He tried to muscle out of it. He was strong, genuinely strong, the kind of gym-built strength that looks impressive under fluorescent lighting and video filters. But strength without structure burns itself out fast. I felt the exact moment his breathing changed, the moment his shoulders started working harder than they needed to because his technique had abandoned him under pressure. I swept his lead foot clean, simple, and put him on the ground. The crowd's murmur sharpened into something closer to shock. Brandon scrambled back up almost immediately, jaw tight now, all the performance drained out of his face and replaced with something raw. He came at me again, faster, more desperate, a real combination behind it this time. I felt the first punch graze past my ear, close enough that the air moved. Something in my chest went cold and sharp and entirely calm, the exact stillness I used to feel in the seconds before a breach, when your body already knows what it's built to do. I stepped behind him. It happened fast enough that I doubt more than a handful of people actually saw the mechanics of it. A rear clinch, hips dropping low, a trip that took his base out from under him before he even registered I'd moved. He hit the pavement hard, the wind audibly leaving him, and I was down with him before he could scramble away. Weight settled across his back, controlling the fight from a position he had no training to escape. Every exchange from there was a foregone conclusion, and he knew it. I could feel it in the way his struggling shifted from strategic to purely instinctive, the flailing of someone who understood, on some animal level, that he was no longer in control of what happened to his own body. I secured his shoulder, isolated the arm, locked it in place with enough control that further struggle would only hurt him. Then I shifted to his neck, a controlled hold, nothing meant to injure, only to communicate that this was finished whenever I decided it was finished. I never threw a single punch. Not once, the whole fight. I want that understood clearly, because it mattered to me in that moment and to everyone watching. This was never about hurting him. It was about ending something he'd started and refused, over and over, to end himself. He tapped my forearm twice, fast, the universal signal, breath ragged and desperate beneath me. I released him instantly. No hesitation, no lingering, no extra second held just to make a point. The moment he tapped, it was over, completely. the way it should always be. I got to my feet first and extended a hand down to him. After a long beat, pride visibly warring with exhaustion on his face, he took it and I pulled him up. The whole street was silent. Not a phone lowered. Not a word spoken. 75 seconds, according to the timestamp on somebody's video that circulated later, though it had felt both shorter and infinitely longer while it was happening. Brandon stood there in the fading gold light, chest heaving, gloves still on hands that had never once landed a real strike, staring at me like he was seeing an entirely different person than the woman he'd mocked for months. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear. "Winning isn't the same as humiliating someone," I said. "I want you to remember that. I had 100 chances to hurt you tonight, and I didn't take a single one. That was a choice. I need you to understand it was a choice." He didn't say anything back. He just nodded once, something in his face cracking open in a way that had nothing to do with the fight itself. I turned and found Ethan behind the fence, my phone forgotten in his hand, eyes wide with something I hadn't seen on his face in a very long time. Not fear. Not shock, exactly. A kind of dawning recognition, like a puzzle piece finally sliding into place. I walked to him, put my hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "Let's go home." Behind us, I heard Richard's voice cut through the silence, sharp and furious, already reaching for his phone with a different purpose. "Now that's assault," he was shouting, to no one in particular and everyone at once. "Somebody call the police. She assaulted my son." I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I already knew exactly how this was going to end, and it wasn't going to end the way Richard Coleman thought it would. The police arrived within 20 minutes, 2 cruisers pulling up quietly at the edge of the cul-de-sac, while half the neighborhood still stood frozen in the deepening dusk, plates of half-eaten barbecue forgotten on folding tables. Richard had called it in himself, breathless and indignant, using words like assault and unprovoked attack before the officers had even stepped out of their vehicles. I stood with Ethan near our driveway, arms loosely crossed, waiting, because I've learned that the worst thing you can do in a moment like that is act like you have something to hide. The younger of the 2 officers approached first, notepad out, and asked what happened. I told him plainly. Brandon had challenged me publicly, thrown gloves at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses, and I'd accepted a fight he started, on his terms, using techniques designed to control and end the encounter without causing harm. I told him I never struck him once. Not a single punch. He looked skeptical, understandably. That's not usually how these stories go. But then people started coming forward unprompted, phones already in hand. Mrs. Henderson, still holding my watch, played her video without being asked. A neighbor 3 houses down had a clearer angle, catching the whole exchange from the moment the gloves hit the ground. A teenager who'd been filming for his own social media had 11 seconds of Brandon shouting, "Put your money where your mouth is," in crisp, unmistakable audio. By the time 4 different videos had been reviewed on the spot, the picture was undeniable. I hadn't attacked anyone. I'd been baited into a fight I tried repeatedly to avoid, and I'd ended it without ever raising a fist. No charges were filed that night. The older officer, a heavy-set man with kind, tired eyes, pulled me aside as he was leaving and said, low enough that only I could hear, "For what it's worth, ma'am, that was about as clean as I've ever seen someone handle a situation like that." I thanked him. There wasn't anything else that needed saying. Richard, for his part, did not let it go. Not that night, not that week, not that month. I came to understand, in the weeks that followed, that men like Richard Coleman don't experience public humiliation the way most people do. It doesn't register as embarrassment to be absorbed and moved past. It registers as a debt that must be collected. And he decided quickly that if the legal system wasn't going to hand him satisfaction, he'd manufacture it some other way. He hired a private investigator. I found out secondhand, Through a neighbor who worked at the law firm the investigator used to source records, a woman named Diane, who felt enough discomfort about the whole thing to give me a quiet heads-up over the fence one afternoon. Richard wanted everything: my employment history, my financial records, anything that might give him leverage. What the investigation turned up instead was the truth of who I actually was. 22 years of service. Multiple deployments. Command experience in the 75th Ranger Regiment that most civilians, even well-connected ones like Richard, had no real frame of reference for understanding. Decorations he'd never heard of. A current posting at Army Futures Command that put me in rooms with people whose names occasionally showed up in the defense industry newsletters he apparently subscribed to, though he'd never once connected those names to his quiet neighbor with the dented pickup truck. I learned later, through Diane again, that this revelation didn't discourage him. If anything, it emboldened him further, feeding some belief that a woman with that kind of career had powerful people to answer to. People who might be persuaded she'd embarrass the Army by brawling with a civilian at a neighborhood barbecue. He began drafting formal letters on his company letterhead, addressed to the Department of Defense, alleging conduct unbecoming and demanding an official inquiry. I found out about the letters before they were even sent because Richard mentioned it to another neighbor at the mailbox, clearly hoping word would spread and reach me, hoping the mere threat would be enough to make me anxious, apologetic, smaller. He wanted, I think, some visible confirmation that he still held power over the situation. Power he'd felt slipping away from the moment his son tapped out on his own front lawn in front of the whole block. I didn't sweat it. Not out of arrogance, but because I understood something Richard fundamentally didn't. I hadn't done anything wrong. I defended myself, defended my dignity, and done it with more restraint than most people would have managed. There was no version of an honest inquiry that ended badly for me. The only real question was what an inquiry into Richard's own motivations might turn up, a question I hadn't even thought to ask yet, but one the universe was already quietly answering. Ethan asked me one night at the kitchen table whether I was worried. I remember exactly what I told him, because I meant every word. Worry is for situations you don't understand. I understand this one completely. Richard is a man who has never once faced consequences for the way he treats people who don't have his money. He believes that will hold true forever. I've watched men like that before, Ethan. It never holds true forever. He didn't look entirely convinced. He was 15, and 15 doesn't yet believe patience is its own kind of weapon, but he trusted me enough to let it go and finish his dinner. I trusted something else. Something I'd learned a long time ago, in far harder circumstances than this one. When you build your whole life on cutting corners, leaning on money and influence instead of integrity, that foundation eventually cracks under its own weight. You don't need to push it. You just need to wait. I didn't know yet how quickly that structure was about to come down. But I had a feeling. And feelings like that are rarely wrong. The letter landed on the desk of Lieutenant General Michael Donovan on a Tuesday morning in late September, tucked into a stack of routine correspondence his aide had already flagged for review. I only know the specifics of what happened next because Michael told me himself, weeks later, over a phone call that started serious and ended with both of us laughing harder than either of us had in months. Michael and I went back a long way. We'd served together early in my career, before he climbed into 3-star command and I settled into the work I do now at Futures Command. He wasn't just a colleague. He was one of the handful of people who'd watched me grow from a green second lieutenant into someone who could hold a room of colonels silent with a single sentence, and over the years he developed a very specific, very dry sense of humor about anyone foolish enough to underestimate me. He told me later he'd read the first paragraph of Richard's letter, an aggrieved account of conduct unbecoming an officer, an unprovoked physical assault at a private social gathering, and had to set it down because he was laughing too hard to keep reading. Ashley Parker got challenged to a fight. He said he'd told an empty office, and this man is mad she won. But amusement isn't the same as dismissal, and Michael, whatever else he is, has always been thorough. An inquiry opened exactly as Richard had hoped it would. Statements were requested. Video evidence, and there was plenty, given how many phones had been rolling that evening, was reviewed in full. Within days it was clear, beyond any reasonable dispute, that I'd done nothing except respond with considerable restraint to a challenge thrown at my feet in front of dozens of witnesses. The inquiry into my conduct closed almost as fast as it opened, with a formal note in the record commending the composure I'd shown under public provocation. But inquiries, once opened, have a way of generating their own momentum. Somewhere in the process of verifying the basic facts, someone on Michael's staff pulled Richard Coleman's business background, standard due diligence when a private citizen makes serious allegations against a serving officer. What they found had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the foundation Richard had built his comfortable life upon. His development firm had spent years bidding on municipal contracts, several tied to public infrastructure projects with partial federal funding. That thread, thin as it seemed, was enough to draw the attention of people whose job is to notice when federal money intersects with irregularities. And once they started looking, they found plenty: falsified bid documentation on at least 3 contracts, a network of shell subsidiaries that existed for no purpose other than letting Richard's firm sidestep minority contractor requirements while appearing to comply with them on paper, and payments to a county zoning official that, traced through several intermediary accounts, looked far less like consulting fees than what they actually were. I want to be clear, because it matters to me that this story is told honestly. I did not orchestrate any of it. I made no calls, wrote no letters, pulled no strings. I have never once, in my entire career, used my position to settle a personal grievance, and I wasn't about to start over a dispute that began with a man throwing gloves at my feet at a barbecue. What happened to Richard Coleman happened because Richard Coleman built his empire on dishonesty and made the singular, catastrophic error of inviting official scrutiny into his own life at the exact moment that scrutiny was primed to look closely at everyone involved. The Defense Contract Audit Agency got involved first, given the federal funding tied to some of his projects. Then the FBI, once the zoning payments held up under a proper look. The IRS followed once his shell company structure raised the kind of red flags auditors dream about. Within 6 weeks of sending a letter meant to destroy my career, Richard Coleman found himself the subject of 3 separate federal inquiries, his development contracts frozen pending review, tens of millions of dollars in projects suspended indefinitely. I heard about it in pieces, the way you hear about a house collapsing from 2 streets over, the sound first, then the dust, then eventually the full shape of what happened. Diane kept me loosely updated, always with the same note of disbelief in her voice. "He did this to himself," she said to me once, almost in wonder. "He had a legitimate business. He didn't need to cut those corners. He just couldn't help it." Brandon's world came apart on a smaller, parallel track. His gym, sensing the shift in his father's reputation and unwilling to be associated with either the viral video of his defeat or the mounting federal scrutiny around his family, quietly suspended his membership, citing conduct concerns tied to the Labor Day incident, by then viewed close to 2 million times across various platforms. His sponsors, a regional supplement company and a local gym apparel brand, both issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves from him within the same week. The highlight reel stopped. The caption stopped. For the first time since I'd moved to Cedar Ridge, Brandon's garage stayed quiet in the mornings. I felt something complicated watching all of it unfold, something that wasn't triumph, not exactly. I'd spent my whole career believing that real consequences tend to find people eventually, without anyone needing to manufacture them. I hadn't wanted this for Richard, not specifically, not at this scale. I'd simply wanted to be left alone to raise my son in peace, to live the quiet life I'd earned after 2 decades of service. But watching it happen, I understood that this had never really been about me. Richard Coleman's downfall had been built years before I ever moved on to Larkspur Lane. I had simply been the thread that, once pulled, unraveled something that had been fraying all along. Ethan asked me one evening in October, watching a local news segment on the fraud investigation, whether I felt bad about it. I thought about the question longer than I expected to. No, I told him finally. I feel bad for anyone who has to watch their family fall apart. That's hard to witness, even when the person falling built the whole collapse himself. But I don't feel responsible for it, Ethan. And neither should you. We didn't do this. We just stopped absorbing what wasn't ours to carry, and everything else followed its own gravity. By late November, the Coleman house had a for sale sign planted crooked in the front lawn, the kind of sign that goes up when a family is selling out of necessity rather than choice. I watched it from my porch some mornings, coffee in hand, and felt none of the satisfaction I might have expected back in September, when Richard was still filming my fight with his son and shouting about assault to a police officer who clearly wasn't buying it. Watching a family lose their home doesn't feel like victory. It just feels heavy, in a quieter way than everything that came before it. The bank foreclosed in early December. Diane, who'd become something like a genuine friend over those months, told me Richard's legal fees alone had eaten through whatever cash reserves the family had left once the federal investigations gathered speed. And once his contracts stayed frozen through the fall building season, the income simply stopped coming in fast enough to cover what he owed. They moved out on a gray Tuesday morning. A moving truck backed into the driveway where Brandon used to rev his motorcycle at 6 a.m., and by that afternoon the house was empty, the street quiet in a way it hadn't been since before I moved in. Nobody threw a party about it. Nobody gathered at the mailbox to gossip with any real relish. I think, in the end, most of the neighborhood had simply grown tired of the noise the Colemans brought with them everywhere they went, and their absence felt less like a triumph and more like an exhale, a street finally allowed to settle back into itself. Brandon came to see me the week before they left. I remember being surprised by the knock, more surprised to find him standing there alone, no phone, no audience, nothing performative about the way he stood on my porch, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, shoulders drawn in a way I'd never seen on him before. He looked younger than 22 in that moment. He looked, honestly, like a kid who'd finally run out of road. I wanted to say something before we go, he said, not quite meeting my eyes at first. I've been thinking about it a lot. The fight. Everything before it, too. The stuff with Ethan's bike. The way I talked to you. All of it. He paused, jaw working like the words were harder to get out than he'd expected. I should have listened. You tried to tell me something that day at the party, and I was too busy trying to look tough for a camera to actually hear it. I stood in my doorway and looked at him for a long moment, this young man who'd spent months treating our street like his personal stage, now standing there with something genuinely humbled in his posture. I thought about all the things I could have said, about accountability, about the family he was leaving behind, about the version of himself he'd have to build from scratch somewhere new. In the end, I kept it simple, because I found the truest things usually are. Strength isn't measured by who you can beat, I told him. It's measured by who you choose not to hurt. You had 100 chances that day to walk away before it ever got to gloves on the ground, and you didn't take a single one. That's the lesson here, Brandon. Not the fight. What happened before it? He nodded slowly, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw something behind his eyes that looked like it might actually stick. Can I say sorry to Ethan? Before we go, I called Ethan down, and I watched from the kitchen doorway as the two of them stood on my porch, Brandon apologizing in a voice stripped of all its old bravado, Ethan listening with the particular grace 15-year-olds sometimes surprise you with, the grace of someone who never needed revenge to feel whole, only acknowledgement. They shook hands. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just two boys, in their own way, closing a door that had been open and swinging too long. The Colemans moved 3 states away, somewhere Richard had extended family, who could offer him a fresh start once the legal dust settled. I heard secondhand that he eventually pled to a reduced set of charges, paid substantial restitution, and lost his contractor's license permanently. I didn't feel the need to follow the story much further than that. Some chapters close on their own, and you don't need to read every page to understand how the book ends. Cedar Ridge went back to being exactly what the listing had promised me back in June: quiet, unremarkable, peaceful in the specific way that only comes after storms pass through and clear out. I still run every morning at 5:30. Same gray shirt, same worn-in shoes, same empty street humming with early light before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. But something's different now. Something small but real. The neighbors who used to look past me, who never quite registered the woman at the end of the street, stop now. They wave. Sometimes they walk out to their mailboxes a little early just to say good morning, and I always say it back, because that's what neighbors do once the noise finally clears enough to hear each other properly. Ethan's doing well. He made varsity soccer that spring, and he doesn't talk about that summer much anymore. But every once in a while, when someone at school tries to push him around the way Brandon once did, I notice he doesn't flinch the way he used to. He just watches, calm, unbothered, the exact stillness I spent 20 years learning myself, quietly passed down without either of us ever really discussing it. I think about that whole season often, honestly. Not with anger anymore. With something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because it taught me all over again something I'd already learned once, in a much harder place, under much harder circumstances. That patience isn't passivity, and walking away isn't weakness. The people who mistake your restraint for fear are always, eventually, the ones who learn the hardest lesson of all. Bullies mistake patience for weakness. They never realize that the strongest people are usually the last ones looking for a fight. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to know where it found you today. Drop a comment and tell me what part hit hardest. I read every single one. And if you're the kind of person who believes quiet strength always wins in the end, hit subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you, week after week. Let's keep this journey going together.